First, let me say a very warm good afternoon to everybody who's joined us. We will get started now because I know that there's a lot of ground to cover. I'll very quickly introduce the panelists so that we know who they are from the very beginning. I'm David Treisman. I was a minister in both Tony Blair and Gordon Brown's governments, long-term by background academic and also businessman and a banker, with a deep passion for the issue of clean growth. And I'm absolutely delighted that we've got an extraordinary panel today, a really remarkable panel, and I'm sure that everybody will want to hear from them. Let me start with Sir Dave King. Sir Dave and I have known each other for a long time. He was the chief scientific advisor to the government when I had the privilege of being in the government, and there were quite a few occasions when we found that we needed to work together. And he's a Cambridge professor, chemistry professor, and has played a central role, I think, in the development of climate change politics, policy, science itself, and trying to remediate the climate, not just to stop things being pumped out into it, through his strategic work in that area, and also an advisor to countries around the world, including Rwanda in Africa. Martin Wood and I, who've met each other once or twice in the recent past, I'm delighted that such a highly qualified engineer is taking a leading role in the civil service. It has not always been thus, I can tell you. Not quite sure what that sound was in the background, but there we are. That's the life of Zoom. Martin is really taking, I think, a fundamental role in making sure that clean vehicles and the clean technology around clean vehicles are the way in which we develop. And last but not least, Pam Thomas from the quite extraordinary Faraday Institute. Every time I read something new about the Faraday Institute, I become even more inspired by what we're trying to do in developing and conserving electricity as a format and for our future. And I think this is an incredibly important time. Everybody talks about building back better, but of course there's no building back better unless we build back cleaner. And if we build back in a way that gives us a sustainable future, but a future which doesn't poison us and doesn't poison our kids and our grandkids, this is the moment to seize this. And today's session, to conclude my introduction, is the first session of the Clean Growth Leadership Network, which brings together scientists, academics, business people, policymakers, people who both want to think their way through these problems, probably argue about them, think their way through these problems, but also do something about these issues, actually make a constructive commitment to doing things about it. And the Clean Growth Leadership Network has been brought together initially by 4 people, including Sir Dave, who is one of the panelists, myself, Lord Des Brown, and Martin Bellamy of the Salamanca Group, the merchant bank. And the aim of it is to have an impact on developing a better, cleaner environment. With the first calling post, I guess, being this one, but very soon afterwards, moving on to the development towards COP, absolutely critical event. And I think I'm right in saying 103 days from now, but I might be out by a day. If I am, I do apologize. Let me start at once by getting into the subjects that everybody who's joining us has indicated are the things that they really do want to talk about. And in essence, a lot of this is going to be about lithium-ion. It's going to be about electric vehicles. It's going to be about storage. It's going to be about the challenges, which goodness knows are very considerable. And it is, I think, going to be about the things that we can do as fast as we can humanly do them to make the kind of changes that I've described, all but very briefly and probably in a rather crude way. And so let me start, if I may then, with electric vehicles. And with you, Pam, because obviously such a lot of the work of the Faraday has been in this area, in an area where we know that the pollution of greenhouse gases coming from cars accounts for, what is it, 15 to 18%, I think, of the greenhouse gases at the moment. Nissan's just made an important announcement about a gigafactory in the UK. What difference will it actually make?
Thank you, Lord Treesman. So yes, Nissan have of course announced that they're going to put a gigafactory in Sunderland in the UK. It's a 9.5 gigawatt hour per annum factory, and that's not huge, but it's a very good first step in that we're bringing battery manufacturing into the UK, being part of the global race to be battery manufacturers, which obviously helps to protect our automotive industry in going to the future. So as members of the Faraday Institution, where of course we're researching current and future battery technologies, it's really great to feel that the research and innovation in the country is coming to underpin these manufacturing facilities. It's a toe in the water. We're going to need about 40 gigawatt hours per annum in 2030 and up to 140 per annum by 2050. So there's a long way to go, but it means that the UK are now established in this manufacturing industry, which is testament to some government interventions that we've had in recent years, including the Faraday Battery Challenge, of which we're part. So really significant start.
Pam, rather a difficult question, I guess, because it's like predicting the future is always difficult. You said it was a toe in the water. How many years do you think we'll have before we have a leg in the water?
Yeah, so right. So I mean, we've predicted from the Faraday Institution's market analysis that we're going to need 7 of these gigafactories by 2040, and we know there's been an announcement of manufacturing electric vehicles as well in Ellesmere Port since the Sunderland announcement. So it does feel like there's some sort of acceleration in getting these gigafactories and the electric vehicle manufacturing as well in the UK.
Well, that is encouraging to hear. Obviously, quite a way to go. But one of the people who's been, I think, instrumental in the government's policy is you, Martin. May welcome you to the seminar, and perhaps start by saying that when we talk about the kinds of raw materials that we need for successful construction and powering of electric vehicles, the transition that we need to make, so many of those materials come from countries which export them, but which are in many respects problematic. They're problematic socially, they're problematic politically. Our relationship with them can be quite testing. As a former Foreign Office minister, I'm very well aware of how difficult it can be to both need to trade, but also to do so with people who you hope will behave ethically. What do you think? How do you assess the resilience of the supply chain that we will need in these quite complex circumstances?
Yeah, thank you, Lord Treesman. It's certainly a point that comes up when we talk with all the battery investors, including Envision AESC, who Pam has just referenced, and their extremely exciting investment, because these companies also want a resilient and safe and ethical supply chain. So it's very much not just about the gigafactories, it's about attracting investment into the UK and even in other areas of Europe where that makes more sense, to create a more robust supply chain, both from a distance point of view, but also recognising the concerns that you've put on the table, which the most obvious one is around cobalt, where there's a number of concerns on how that's extracted and let's say the practices.
Martin, I think we lost you there for a moment, saying the practices in relation to the extraction of cobalt. I don't know if you can hear me. Well, look, what we'll do, because we've got quite a lot of ground to cover, is I'll come back to you when you are unfrozen. Hopefully our supply lines of cobalt will be unfrozen as well. But let me turn, if I may, to you, Sir Dave. What are the challenges for the electric vehicle market? What are they going to have to overcome?
Well, I think easily the biggest challenge, David, is the provision of charging points. What will be needed is the public provision of charging points everywhere where cars are parked. And so this is a very, very extensive demand. It's already restricting the purchase of electric vehicles. Right here where I'm sitting in Cambridge, I can't buy an electric vehicle because there's no way I can charge it when I'm leaving it overnight at my house. So that has to be, in my view, the single biggest challenge. And it does require the government to step in and see that the regulatory system is produced, that the finance is found, and that it's rolled forward.
That, if I may say so, I think that's a really, really interesting answer. It was only yesterday, and I was asking questions in the House about exactly that point, and was being told by a minister that they were hopeful that there would be 4,000 charging points in the UK within a few years. That doesn't seem to me to be a great inducement to do what I also want to do. I mean, I've got a hybrid car, but I'd rather go to a fully electric one.
Yes, I mean, let me just say, there are many instances where new car parks have been installed over the last 5 years and no charging points put into them. Right, so we're missing a massive opportunity for every month that goes by. So I would say to you, you've got a voice in the House of Lords, but to anyone who has a voice in government, please get off your backsides and see that we can deliver what you have promised. When the Prime Minister announced at G7 that we will have reduced our emissions by 78% compared with 1990 levels by 2035, we need a follow-up. How do we deliver that? We certainly won't deliver that if we remain tardy, not only on electric vehicles, but on almost every other aspect of delivery.
Well, I greatly appreciate you saying that. I'm going to come back to Martin, who I think has been able to rejoin us. But just to say that I asked where the electric points for recharging were in the car park of the House of Lords. And of course, they turn out to be behind all the scaffolding required to keep the building standing. So no one can actually use them, but that's life's rich pageant, I guess. Martin, I think you're probably back with us. I do hope so. You were just talking about the sourcing of cobalt before we lost our connection with you.
Yeah, many apologies. I seem to be having major issues with Zoom today. I had a similar problem in the previous meeting, and it seems to drop out as soon as I say anything, Lord Treesman. So please accept my apologies and to the audience. I'll keep trying to get back in. So cobalt really is let's say the perfect example of where we need to take a holistic approach on the whole supply chain to have an ethical conclusion with our materials as they go into battery manufacturers. And the point I was just leaving on was the whole issue of embedded carbon in materials as well, which has got to be completely decisive. Actually, the UK is in a great place because our electricity is decarbonising faster than anyone else's in the G7, in fact the G20. And of course, coal-fired electricity powering processes that are making battery materials doesn't make, well, really any sense for the long term.
Thank you. Yeah, well made point. I appreciate that a lot. I mean, maybe we should move on to that, having generated the electricity and hopefully found a way of getting it into our cars, to the whole of the issue of lithium-ion as a force in energy storage. And I've been hearing, as others will have been, many of the discussions about the relative merits of green hydrogen and blue hydrogen and the other sorts of alternatives for powering just about anything, actually, powering just about anything. But I wonder, Pam, whether I can come to you, is lithium-ion going to be the dominant force, do you think, in this range of options?
So I think lithium-ion technology will be the dominant technology for the automotive sector for passenger cars and so on. So building on where we've already got to in the global technology. But it's not necessarily going to be that the same technology for the other applications one will see for heavy goods vehicles, for marine, for rail. We might be looking at sodium-ion batteries, or we might be looking at hydrogen technology or hybrid fuel cell battery technology. So I think we very much have to keep in mind that it's horses for courses. One shouldn't be looking to say, well, we've got this technology, so let's apply it to everything. Also, I think to pick up on the discussion you just had about the supply chain and cobalt and so on, lithium-ion is coming very close to its theoretical limits in what it can do. If we want to go to a future where we have batteries for cars that are longer range, that are safer, that are cheaper, then we will want perhaps different chemistries. And one might then look at chemistries that don't use cobalt at all. And some of our research programs are devoted to those kinds of battery chemistries beyond the current lithium-ion technology. So I think, yes, the answer is in the near term for passenger cars, lithium-ion technology is going to be the winner. But you need to think about the long-term future as well, in terms of what other kinds of chemistries we can study and use that may be amenable to more ethical sourcing.
Right, and I entirely take the point about different sorts of vehicles and so on needing different kinds of power. Martin, is the centre of the government's thinking then really about lithium-ion? Is that the way in which the government policy will be directed? At least for those vehicles which would use lithium-ion batteries rather than the other sources.
Yeah, I think, I mean, we talk about zero emission vehicles, and I think that's important because it's where we're trying to get to rather than, let's say, the chemistry of how we get there, which is important. And I say that because, building on Pam's point, one of the ways that companies de-risk on cobalt is they're increasingly looking at LFP, particularly for small vehicles, which are cobalt free. And that's also completely fine. So I don't think the chemistry is as decisive as the outcome. And that's really what we're trying to support business and help them de-risk their investments about achieving those outcomes. I think that's the way I would look at it.
And so when potential inward investors are talking to you and talking to the government, they're looking at that kind of variety of different chemistries as well.
I mean, it's driven by the car makers themselves, who we stay very close to, of course, because any investment work that we do has to deliver the successful transformation of our OEMs. So it's very much how the OEMs are specifying their batteries from a structural point of view, whether it's cylindrical, prismatic, or pouch, and then to a chemistry point of view to meet whatever performance target they have. And we're seeing this range of battery chemistry solutions depending on the vehicle application, whether it's a small car, maybe a larger people carrier, or a bus or a truck. There's a range of different solutions that meet the let's say boundary conditions of package versus performance versus cost versus safety, etc.
Right. Dave, we're coming up to, as we said earlier, we're coming up to COP. What should we be asking for at COP in relation to lithium-ion batteries? What would be the things that you would place at the top of your list of demands and potential achievements?
So I think when it comes to COP, David, I think it would be back to exactly what Martin's just been saying. Zero emission vehicles has got to be the program.
Right.
And the actual chemistry is secondary to that. I don't expect that the COP would favor one angle over another. All of the discussion, however, that we've been having, for example, about mining, energy use in mining, etc. Cobalt, where is it coming from? Lithium supplies, all of these issues are critical, but I don't think we're going to see a detailed discussion on this, frankly, at COP. The discussion will center around how we make the energy transition from being fossil fuel based to being fossil fuel zero deep and rapid, and how quickly can we achieve it, and what regulatory procedures are required to speed up the transition.
That's obviously a really, really key point, because while I can imagine, however long it might take us, we could potentially produce a regulatory regime in this country. At least I know what the mechanics of doing that are. Would we expect comparable regulatory regimes elsewhere? What are the, I mean, you've got great experience of COP. What are the difficulties in getting people to align their regulatory thinking?
I think the way COP operates is that on issues like that, best practice is absolutely key to all of the thinking in the COP process. So, of course, in the negotiations, we're negotiating on everything that can be achieved to get to deep and rapid emissions reduction as quickly as possible. And I would say we also need greenhouse gas removal at scale. But I don't think that the nuts and bolts will go into the negotiations themselves. That will be left up to countries working together. The force of bilaterals between, just one country talking to another is much, much greater than the force of 197 nations all meeting together. Let me just say, with an average of 20 official negotiators per country, and the United States beating the rest with 150 official negotiators. Now, what that means is that those negotiators are talking to each other in the margins of the negotiations. And those discussions are what I'm referring to. These are very important. It's a global venue, it's a unique global venue, and we can spread best practice through that procedure.
So this is a procedure which, to characterize it perhaps a little unfairly, but it's a procedure which gathers together the willing in a dynamic force.
It gathers together the willing, and I'm going to make a very pointed comment, if I may, which is that there is no single international agreement of any substance that has been achieved since 1945, including the setting up of the United Nations, that hasn't been led by one country, the United States. We have been suffering from almost zero leadership from the United States, and this has made it very difficult. Yes, Britain played a strong, and is still playing a strong leadership role in the negotiations, but we don't have the power of the United States. Now we do have the United States and China talking to each other in a very practical way, and I think this gives me some hope that COP26 will lead us in a much better direction.
Thank you. Let me come on to some of the other challenges. Now, we touched on some of them, so I think in the interest of time we can probably just check that we've said as much as we want to about them. Martin, you were making the point about cobalt, and I think 3/4 of the cobalt that we use comes from the DRC, which is quite a problematic country in lots of ways. It doesn't really meet any of the requirements of international compliance to international law or whatever. Is that going to be a limiting factor?
I think it could be, Lord Treesman. I think there are other limiting factors as well, as we see exponential growth from let's say, the market side. The challenge we have is and Sir David touched earlier on the activities from the mining side. So for all materials, cobalt, particularly lithium.
You see, as soon as we get to a chemical, I think there's something. You're a professor of chemistry, Dave. You should be able to solve this. Martin, I don't know if you can hear, but once again, we will come back to you. You were just mentioning lithium, and I was going to ask Dave whether the sourcing of lithium is itself a significant challenge.
I think I don't have figures. Very useful to have that figure of 3/4 of cobalt coming from the DRC. I wish I could tell you what percentage of lithium comes from Chile, and it may be that Pam can tell us.
I think it's certainly more than 50%. I don't have an exact figure, but it's dominant. Yeah.
We're very reliant on the Chilean source.
I'm going to craft a parliamentary question because it's the sort of thing we really should have the information on. So really, it's about, I won't use the word monopoly because I don't really want to use it in the strict economics sense, but just the rarity of the disposition around the planet of these materials. And Pam, you've had recent significant breakthroughs, I think, in battery material recovery, which itself may make a difference to the sourcing of the materials that can be used. I wonder if you could tell us about that.
Yes, of course, with pleasure. So we have a large recycling research project led out of the University of Birmingham as part of our suite of Faraday research projects in the portfolio. And investigators in Leicester in particular and in Birmingham on that project have recently devised a new method of recycling battery materials, which is an ultrasonic method. So if you think about ultrasonic processes, it basically shakes the important metals off their metal plates in the battery and allows us to recover the cobalt, the nickel that sit therein. And actually they're able to do it 100 times faster than any other technique with this ultrasonic method. And it's cleaner and greener. They don't have to use nasty acids or high temperatures. So it's a very exciting development, still in the early stages, of course. They've got a patent application underway, but I think it's causing a lot of excitement in the battery science and technology community. They're hoping in 2022, 2023 to pilot it in a scale-up facility in the UK. So, I mean, it's that kind of, that of course, it's twofold. One is recovering as much of the metal as we can, the elements that we can. So that cuts down on needing to mine the elements in the first place. But also, I mean, it speaks to having a green life cycle for battery technology in that we recycle what we've made. You know, because these are really quite unpleasant chemistries to disassemble at end of life in batteries. So the more we can learn about producing batteries that are amenable to recycling and then having green processes so to do, then the better we are towards a net zero in our EVs. It's not just they emit zero, I mean, it's how we produce them as well. We need to get into a green method of manufacturing.
So,
yeah. Dave, yeah.
Could I just make a comment to that? What Pam's talking about is critically important because tied up with everything that we're working on is the circular economy. And this is just a beautiful example of the circular economy. We have been, for example, using petrol-driven vehicles, diesel-driven vehicles, which have to have platinum-sourced material in the back end of the car to convert carbon monoxide and other noxious materials into something less noxious. We no longer will have to put those car exhaust catalysts into the back end of these cars. They don't produce a lethal exhaust system. But we do have these metals. So the recovery of platinum, by the way, has never made a lot of ground from the platinum car exhaust systems. But I think that what Pam is saying is taking us into a totally new place with these batteries, because recovery of the metals is a major path forward. Can I just also say that at the moment, lithium-ion batteries are extraordinarily cheap. They've fallen in price very dramatically over the last 10 years. And this is because of increased demand, more sophistication in manufacture, and as manufacturing has to meet a bigger demand, it gets more efficient. This is the way the system works. But there is a turning point. And the turning point comes when demand is creating problems for the supply of these materials, cobalt and lithium, for example. And that's the point at which the cobalt and lithium prices are likely to start rising. So as we move into an era of massive use of electric vehicles, we've got to anticipate a rise in prices of these materials, which really puts such a big target on recirculating. So congratulations to Pam and her team for the piece of work that we've understood. I see Martin's back.
Martin, you are. We've been talking about both cobalt and lithium since we last saw you, and the relatively small number of places in which you can get either, and whether this imposes supply chain difficulties. But we've also been talking about metallic recovery in batteries, which could be a very significant feature of the future, which obviously Faraday are working on very hard. Sorry, please, Martin.
Yeah, no, thank you. Emergency change of computer, so we'll hopefully this will work better, and sincere apologies. Yeah, so on the material side, there clearly needs to be a pull through of investment and demand into the mines for a number of the materials. But I think Sir David makes a really good point, building on what Pam has said around recycling. And of course, there is legislation coming which is driving recycling, which you may have mentioned already, which vehicle makers will have to meet. And I'm pleased to say the vehicle makers I talk to are already considering these recycling requirements and recycling needs, and looking to see how they can frankly gain some advantage by doing that. So they see that as a potential point of difference. So I think that's it's at least interesting. And what it also brings into our investment portfolio is a range of companies that are interested to invest and develop recycling technologies and processes here in the UK.
That's again very, very interesting to hear, and I think it helps me link together not two other issues. One of them is the issue we've just been talking about, and Dave was referring to the kinds of scientific breakthrough, and earlier was talking about the availability of charging points and there not being anywhere in Cambridge, which disappoints me since I'm going to be spending more of my time there as well. One of the things which also came up in the discussion yesterday with ministers was the shortage of engineers and skilled people in almost all of these areas, where we're talking about fundamental research, which I'm sure is chemists and engineers, and probably the boundaries between them are not so significant as the objectives there we're working on, Pam. But do we have a shortage of the kinds of engineers and skills that we need in the area of current and anticipated battery technologies?
So I think we certainly need to be educating a workforce for the electrified future of battery technology. So we have predicted that we're going to need about 40,000 technicians and engineering specialists to service the 150 gigawatt hours per annum of manufacturing battery technology in the UK. And so this is going to be at every level, from PhD trained scientists and engineers at the highest level of skills, to the apprentice technicians and so on, who would be operating in the factories. And even beyond that, if you look at the whole electrified future, we need to be able to deal with, for example, crashes between electric cars. And in the way that is dealt with at the moment is that a fire service person has to go and sit for 24 hours at the crash site before anything can be done with the vehicle that has been in the accident. I mean, this is not sustainable for the future as we get more and more of these cars on the road. So actually, across the whole of our lifestyle. We need to be adapting to the fact that we're going away from the combustion engine towards battery-powered vehicles and an electrified life. So yes, there's a lot more that needs to be done. We are working at the top end. We've got 131 affiliated PhD students in battery science, and they come from a wide range of disciplines, actually. It's a very interdisciplinary subject. It doesn't fit neatly into chemistry or physics or engineering. So we are doing at that end what needs to be done to support this industry coming to the UK, but clearly much more at all levels of education needs to be done.
I always find it very inspiring. Well, one of my other past jobs was Minister for Higher Education and Innovation, but to hear of those kind of multidisciplinary teams, because it was always the case that they were needed, but they weren't always there.
Yeah.
Dave, do you feel, well, I know you've got something to say. Can I just add a question to ask you as well? And it's that quite aside from the construction of the batteries, the kind of chemistry, the kind of engineering, physics and so on, what about the infrastructure itself? Do we have the technical capability to build this kind of infrastructure so that, you know, you could go from Cambridge to Caithness without worrying?
Let me take the two together. So this is the question of scientists and engineers and the question of infrastructure. I am not going to disagree with anything that Pam has just said, but what I would also say, however, two things. First, this country has always undervalued engineers compared with, for example, France and Germany. Right, so if you look across Europe, you'll find the status of an engineer is rather higher than the status of a scientist. And I would say here, it was in reverse, but now, largely because of the replacement of Hoovers, I won't mention the person who introduced this from Britain, but the status of engineers has been rising more recently. So this will happen when the demand for the engineers that we're talking about now goes up. We always see in the university sector that where there is demand, it feeds back into young people coming into universities in those disciplines. There is a balancing that does happen. There's often too much of a gap, and that's really why it's worth discussing. But the second point is, we do have an industry that will come to an end, and that is the oil and gas industry. And this is an industry that does employ a significant number of engineers. I mean, here's an interesting thing that's already happened. Marine engineers working for the oil and gas industry in hundreds have gone over and joined the offshore wind industry and have transformed it. These people with the knowledge of marine engineering have been able to create the most efficient wind turbines in the world. And so this business of having expertise in what seems to be a different discipline isn't right. These people who are really qualified engineers are able to switch across, and actually added from the fact that they had come from a different industry. So I think I wouldn't be gloomy about the supply of brilliant young scientists and engineers coming through, drawn by two things. One is this industry arising, but also, and this is very important, young people are very interested in sustainability, in managing the transitions required under climate change. In Cambridge many years ago, we put on an optional course in the final year in chemistry, which was on the ozone hole, and this led into climate change. It wasn't optional in the first year we ran it. Almost every single student opted for it. And so we expected a quarter of the students, and we got virtually the whole lot. So there's an interesting thing. Young people are more likely to move into a job that does seem to be fit for the purpose in the 21st century. You only have to talk to companies like Unilever, who know that the number of applicants per job, since they declared themselves as a sustainability company, just went soaring upwards.
I think that's a really telling point, because certainly in the banking world, we see the kind of companies who are looking for investment making a huge amount of their credentials as being sustainable, as employing in a sustainable way. I mean, just things which would never have appeared in a conventional balance sheet are now front and center of so many of those balance sheets. I was wondering, Martin, in your dealings as a government with, so I'm not going to blame you for anything ministers say, but your dealings as the people who make everything tick in government, with investors and people coming in, whether you also see this as being now quite central, quite focal.
Yeah, yes, definitely, and I agree. You know, I'm from a business background myself. In fact, most of my career has been in business, and for sure, business sees value in presenting the right face to consumers, and not just a face, but explaining a shift in strategy, making things like sustainability more important. And you see that every day, even on the television, in adverts or whatever. And certainly as we talk with companies, you can see some companies have really got that, and some companies are starting to get it. And without repeating myself, going back to what I was saying earlier in terms of the mix of electricity, how it's generated, some companies are already saying we need to be somewhere where the electricity used to produce our battery materials is produced in a sustainable way. Whereas only 2 to 3 years ago, companies weren't really getting the message, or weren't alive to the message, that there is a huge contradiction if you're shifting from an internal combustion engine to a battery driven car where the carbon is embedded instead. So I think that's a perfect example that companies really get that, and it makes good business sense, but it also makes good long-term brand positioning sense. And to Sir David's point, young people always want to work for a company that stands for the kinds of things they stand for. And during this pandemic, I have young adults myself, children, let's say. I can see how they view the world and what's important from a sustainability point of view. And it really echoes Sir David's point. They want to get involved in things which really resonate to their viewpoints around sustainability.
I feel sure that's right. And I've been really quite fascinated by some of Mark Carney's recent writing, which has I think, laid out a case in a way that only a really quite expert banker could do, of how people should read balance sheets and all of the associated notes in the future. They're going to look very unlike they did in the past, I have a feeling. We have about 14 minutes left, Dave, and I know that you're probably, like all of us, under particular time constraints. Can I just ask a couple of quick questions and then go to perhaps a more aspirational question to help us sum up? The first is, do we have the kind of knowledge and the kind of techniques that would be necessary to assess and to issue the permits that would be necessary for new recycling facilities for batteries? Do we run a risk of them being dumped at roadsides? Do we run the risk of not having prepared ourselves for what could be very significant breakthroughs? Perhaps we'll start with you, Martin, as you're live and your computer's healthy.
Thank you, Lord Treisman. I mean, if I'm entirely honest, it's not really an area of my specialism, but I think in general we are looking and we are acting and getting our legislative process around these challenges for the future. And there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to employ the right regulation around the disposal or the reuse, actually I should call it, of a battery, as we do with anything else. And it will develop its own revenue stream that will make it the obvious thing to do. So for example, and taking perhaps a slightly left field example, I live in an old house, and there was quite a lot of lead piping still in the house when I moved in. Now, the last thing that I was going to do with that lead piping is just dump it, because it actually had a value, and a relatively short and relatively convenient trip to a scrap dealer. Actually, I had a few pounds back that I could perhaps distribute to my next generation. Let's put it that way. So I think actually the revenue streams around battery recycling will also play a big part, that there is value in not just disposing in a ad hoc or irresponsible way.
You're on mute, David.
Sorry, I beg your pardon. I'm now live again. I was being told that I should mute myself because of white noise. So there we are. Dave, do you see any difficulties in the disposal issues? I mean, I think Martin's probably covered it off, but
Yeah, I think I just feel Martin has covered it off, and I certainly think we have the knowledge, the wit, and the experience to do it. I don't think there's any shortage on that side. What I do worry about is whether the government is still in that mode of thinking, let's get rid of regulation rather than bringing in regulation. So to me, that's the only possible problem. And what I'm referring to is 2010 to 2015, when a lot of very good legislation was knocked off the books.
yes, it's true. The old Better Regulation Task Force at least had a process which allowed you to evaluate whether something was still being used effectively. Pam, I don't know whether you wanted to add anything to that.
I don't think so. I mean, clearly, in terms of scientific approach and so on, I mean, recyclability is very high on the agenda. Any innovation now that doesn't have a recycling tick box aspect to it, just is an innovation that will say, well, that's very nice, but it's not for the future. So I think that's one thing. And the other thing, there is a second life element. So we could be using these batteries for grid storage, small grid storage, whatever. So I mean, there are lots of there are different ways of looking at the situation, and I believe we've got the requisite knowledge to do that in a sensible way.
Thank you. Martin, can I come back on one other practical thing, which I know government's thinking about, and ask whether there's any further enlightenment, and that's really the way in which the offshore, particularly shipping industry operates, because it's been a big polluter historically, or at least since the days of wind, it's been a big polluter. There've been several arguments in Parliament about whether onshore points are viable and so on. But it does seem to me that it would be very, very hard to imagine making a lot of progress whilst various kinds of sulfurous bunker fuels and so on are being burned systematically in shipping. What would be your view of that?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, one thing that attracted me to work within government on this really fascinating and once in a 3-generational transformation opportunity, let's say, is the fact that, I mean, I come from the auto sector. I actually started as an engineer in Dagenham back in the day. But the pleasure I get, I guess, in terms of what I do on the investment piece is that we're not just looking at the vehicle sector and the great opportunity there, but we're looking at other sectors. We're looking at how marine could benefit and what the solutions might be for marine. And if companies that are servicing maybe the off-highway sector, which is allied to the auto industry, of course, or the coach sector, the bus sector, maybe there's a follow-on or a let's say an added benefit that could flow into the marine sector or into the rail sector. And I've got colleagues in DIT that are working very closely with those sectors. So we're trying to make sure that any benefits that we can bring into the UK, either from foreign direct investment or UK companies growing, that they realise that the market opportunity is really quite varied. And I mean, I take the premise of your point, which is basically we have to do the whole job. Okay, there's a step-by-step approach to that. We can't boil an ocean in one go, pun intended. But for sure, we have to address every aspect if we are going to meet the challenges in front of us and frankly, deliver a sustainable planet for our children and our children's children.
We whizzed through the time very fast. I had a feeling we would. I'm going to ask if each of you could try and confine your last comments to 2 to 3 minutes. Are we being ambitious enough? Are we being ambitious before COP26? Are we being, I mean, I'm just wondering whether we've seen enough said of a practical kind rather than an aspirational kind to make the next few years more of a success. Perhaps I could ask you first, Pam.
Well, that's a difficult one, and I'm inclined to be aspirational because I'm looking at long-term research and innovation and looking for the breakthroughs that are going to take us beyond lithium-ion to next generation technology. So I would say possibly we haven't been ambitious enough in the short term. We maybe should be looking to get bigger investments, better policy join up across all areas of government in terms of the energy ecosystem and electrifying it and putting the battery technologists together with the offshore wind specialists and looking right across the piece at how we can integrate those technologies together to get more rapidly into a net zero space. So yes, possibly not ambitious enough in the short and immediate term, but I would say also one of the things that we've been rather poor at is having longevity in our efforts. So for example, if I can speak for my organisation, though it's not the only one that is in that position, as the Faraday Institution, we don't have long-term funding. So we're looking to those next generation technologies, the breakthroughs that are going to take us to safer, cheaper, longer lasting batteries in the future, yet we don't have funding beyond the next 18 months. And I think the UK really needs to look at this as a long path to getting to net zero and support both the research and innovation side and the industrial side together on this track with consistent funding over 10, 20-year periods, instead of doing it for a short time for something in fashion and then cutting off and going to do something else. So that would be my final remark.
Thank you very, very much. Well, that invites us to the hardy perennial debate with the Treasury, which is of all the debates we can have, the most difficult. Martin, do you have a couple of concluding points that you want to make?
Yes, thank you, Lord Treesman. I'm going to skip around the government policy point for obvious reason. But I think a couple of things I would like to say. Firstly, during the time of the biggest health crisis in all our lives, potentially, two very significant things have happened. One is the pull forward of the banning of the internal combustion engine in terms of new vehicle sales. The other is the release of the Automotive Transformation Fund and the first tranche of funding, the first 500 million. So I think there's some reasons to be cheerful there. There's some positivity, and that is clearly seen by investors. Of course, we can always do more. What I see in terms of the opportunity, the pandemic has not slowed things down at all. In fact, it's accelerated things. And as companies see restricted balance sheets because of the turmoil of the last 18 months, they're having to place bets. So we do see really significant opportunity, particularly around the battery side. The Envision AESC investment is very much the first one. In fact, I could call it the second one because we have the first gigafactory in Europe already in terms of their first facility. And we're talking with most of the major players, battery investors globally. Most of them are Asian, as you know, and the UK is very much of interest. And in our updated information coming direct from the OEMs, I'll leave you with one stat at the end, which is an update on Pam's stat from the beginning from the Faraday McKinsey study, we're seeing a 90 gigawatt hour demand by 2030. And that's coming from the OEM programs, the way they've pulled things forward. So look, I think it's a really exciting time, and I really hope and trust that government policy will sit alongside for us to deliver it.
Thank you. I mean, I completely agree about the excitement we should feel about the opportunities. I really do. Dave, you probably can time yourself perfectly now, given that you've got another meeting that you have to be at, I know.
Can I just build on what has already been said and say the Climate Change Committee of Parliament was set up as a means of keeping the government of the day in line with that commitment made to get to net zero by 2050. And you will know that the Climate Change Committee of Parliament has recently been very critical of government, saying we don't know how we are going to deliver that 78% reduction by 2035 because we can't see any legislation. Martin's referred to some. We can't see any legislation that is delivering holistically to achieve these objectives. So the Climate Change Committee of Parliament, being set up by Parliament in 2008 to oversee every subsequent government to keep their toes to the line, has been for the first time very critical. And of course, you could say that the government's eye has been taken off the ball with Brexit, with COVID-19, etc. But this is an investment in our future. It's an investment in every sense of the word, whether it's sustainability or whether it's wealth creation, because this is investing in those goods that have a place in the 21st century and not continuing to invest in the oil, gas and coal industry and all of the products that emerge from that. We've got a long way to go. And I know the government's response was they're working on it, everything will emerge. Wouldn't it be good if it could emerge before COP26?
Thank you, Dave. Let me thank everybody. I think it's been just such a pleasure to have heard you all speak and to have heard your ideas. I'd suggested a completely ludicrous idea at one stage, which was that we should build into our long-term economic planning, much as we, in theory at least, and for a long period did do for overseas aid, a proportion of the budget which was going to be specifically ring-fenced, hypothecated for this kind of use, because the character of the problem is so huge and the longevity of the issues is so long that it would need some kind of mechanism that Treasury would understand. But I've felt very, very inspired by our speakers, and I hope everybody who's been listening in has as well. I've tried to get across some of the questions that everybody has asked. I just hope that people will stay in touch with the Clean Growth Leadership Network. Come and argue. I mean, if it's nothing else, come for a good argument, because I'm sure there'll always be contested areas in it. But the thing that will unite us all is that we really want a cleaner, brighter, more durable future for ourselves, for our kids, for our grandkids. And we want to do it by using the best of our knowledge and the best of our energy around practical solutions. So I thank the panel very, very much. I've enjoyed hearing you enormously. And I thank all of those who have taken part. And can I thank Yulia and her immediate staff for having got us together in the first of what I'm sure will be a number of events. Many thanks. Take care. All the best.